This, which is the 7th year of PPIC conversations on the future of California and all of its aspects. I'm Phil Eisenberg. I'm a board member. I'm pleased to welcome you here and also to welcome Tom for showing up. He comes directly from Washington, D.C., where he has secret information, I'm told. Well, anyway, he smiled at me mysteriously when I asked him if he had secret information. I'd like to draw your attention to hopefully what was on the board before, but if not, on the back of your programs. Our sponsors of this are the ones who make this possible, make these 7 years of conversation possible. And as you wander around the room and talk to people at your table, you're going to find a bunch of sponsors that are there, businesses, foundations, nonprofit groups of all kind, and terrific people. And we'd appreciate very much you just thanking them for making this possible. A couple of other things I'd like to mention. Within a short period of time, assuming we have extracted your email address in exchange for this free lunch, you will be getting an email soliciting your opinion on the conversations, how you like them, what you don't like, suggestions for change, suggestions for speakers. And it's very important to us that you would give us the information so we can build it into the planning for these and future events. The last thing is, if your cell phone rings, you're dead. So we would appreciate very much if you would silence your cell phones and all of its ramification, because Mark Baldassare may look innocent, but actually when cell phones go off, he's quite fearsome, quite fearsome. So in any event, it's time to get started on this conversation between Mark Baldassare and Tom Steyer. Gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil Eisenberg, and thanks to all of you for being here with us today. And of course, especially Tom Steyer, who's come in from Washington. A few words of introduction about Tom Steyer. There's a bio in the program today, but we had the privilege of having a conversation before as part of the speaker series in November 2012. It was right after the 2012 election. But just to give you a kind of a recent history of Tom Steyer, who's often referred to as a business leader and philanthropist. So he started and he was the founder of Farallon Capital, and then left that company in 2012. In 2011, I started to hear about Tom Steyer because I started to hear about Next Generation, which Tom was on the board of Next Generation. And then in 2013, had started Next Gen Climate, which he is the founder of Next Gen Climate. So Tom Steyer has been very active and involved in election politics in 2014 and 2016 nationally, promoting candidates and causes, specifically environmental causes. And he's been very active in the initiative process in California. In 2010, Tom was the co-chair of the No on 23 campaign. No on 23 was an effort to, 23 was an effort to take away AB 32, the climate change bill that California had passed in 2006. And there was a bipartisan co-chairs, George Shultz, the Republican, and Tom Steyer, the Democrat. So that was defeated, and then in 2012, Tom was a leading sponsor in Proposition 39, which closed corporate loopholes and used some of those funds for clean energy projects, at least for the first 5 years of those funds, as I understand how it works. And then most recently, in the last election, Proposition 56, the tobacco tax initiative that was on the ballot, which passed in California, Tom was a leading sponsor of that measure. And by the way, there were a number of tobacco taxes around the country, but California was the only one that actually passed a tobacco tax last year. Tom was also active in voter registration efforts last year in California as well. So we'll have a chance to talk to him about that. The reason that he's coming back from Washington today was last night he was honored with the Champion Award for the Campaign for Tobacco for Kids. Gave him gave him the Champion Award. So that was in reference to the work that was done in November. What did I forget?
You got it perfectly.
Okay. So we agreed to start with a question, and then we'll go wherever the conversation takes us, and we'll have some time at the end for some questions that the audience might have. But I wanted to start by asking you about your views about what are the top 3 issues in your mind that will make the most difference for California's future.
So I want to start by just saying thank you for having me here today, Mark.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be back in California in every way. I will say that it was a pleasure to go as a Californian and a Democrat to Washington, D.C. to celebrate a big political triumph. That was an unusual event for a California Democrat. But the 3 biggest issues for California, and I've had a chance to think about this because Mark did say, are issues that are intertwined with each other and they cut across traditional policy areas. And let me just give you the 3 issues and then describe what I think they mean. The first one's income inequality. The second one is the need to invest in our state to basically rebuild the way we live together. And the third one is to protect and strengthen our democracy. Those are all issues. Let me start with income inequality. I know that as a state, we have rebounded since 2008. And if you look at the gross numbers, you'll see that we've gone back and we've grown, we've gone back to profitability. In many ways, we seem more stable, and all of that is good. But if you look at the breakdown of where the income has gone since 2008, you'll see that over 100% of the increase in income has gone to the top 1%. And so what we've seen is the income inequality that exists in the United States is heightened in California. And there's so many different measures in terms of the percentage of kids who live in poverty, the percentage of kids who are on free and reduced lunches. But when we think about income inequality, there are many measures, and it is a complicated topic that touches housing and transportation, education, incarceration, but it is absolutely something for the sake of justice in our state and also the kind of California we want to build that we have to address. The second one I described as investing in our state, rebuilding the way that we live together. And the fact of the matter is we've started to see this in 2016. Our organization, NextGen, supported 16 local measures and 12 statewide measures, including the tobacco tax. And in those measures, we won 2/3 of the ones at the local level and 3/4 of the ones at the state level. But there was an implicit reimagining of California in those measures, because those measures revolved around public transportation, housing, workers' rights. And so what we're seeing is there's a sense in California, and everybody who lives here knows that you spend an unconscionable amount of time on the highways, that in effect we've built the state around the internal combustion engine, and for a variety of reasons. I think that that was an agreement
Yeah, I think so too.
for a variety of reasons. We have to rebuild the way we live. We're 1 million housing units short, for starters. We could see in Los Angeles a huge move to increase the sales tax and use it to build public transportation. We can see this coming up all around the state, but we have to acknowledge that we're going to have to do this so that we can have a livable state that preserve the beauty of California, have a way for us to live together well, have a sustainable future. And the third one is to preserve and protect our democracy. And I think it's obvious that there's a direct attack on American rights and values coming out of the federal government, and specifically Californian rights and values coming out of the federal government. But I think, to be fair, it's broader than that. When we look at California, there is a need. I think if you look at the 3 propositions that I've co-chaired, which are no on 23, 39, and 56, every one was a direct contest with a special interest. No on 23 was a direct fight with oil companies. 39 was a direct fight with out-of-state companies that had very significant sales in California. And 56 was a direct fight with the tobacco companies. And this year we're pushing really hard for transparency in pharmaceutical pricing. What we see is Californian citizens are basically losing a silent fight with special interests, organized, funded, consistent, relentless special interests. And so that is something that shows up in a variety of ways, but including in the income inequality. The rules about how people get employed are super important in terms of how people get paid, what benefits they get. And so what we're seeing when I say protect our democracy, I really do, there is, those first 2 issues and the third issue are inexplicably linked, inextricably linked. And so when we think about these issues, they cut across the traditional siloed ways of thinking. I mean, when you think about rebuilding the state, obviously I'm somebody who's been worried about climate and sustainability in a very serious way. But when I think about solving that problem, I think it addresses many of the other issues we have in terms of employment, how much you get paid, where the jobs go, the health of our citizens. So when I think about those 3 issues, I think you can't separate them, and you've got to take a systems approach in terms of determining how that's going to work for working families and middle-class people in the state of California.
So, well, thank you. When you think about these 3 issues and you think about where you just came back from, Washington, are these issues that you see California will act alone and independently to solve in our state?
Okay. Well, so let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing out of the federal government. And I think, it's no secret that that I'm a Democrat and that the President of the United States is a Republican, the Congress is controlled by Republicans, the Senate is controlled by Republicans, and that they have a very specific agenda. So if you were to go through those 3 issues, starting with income inequality, they have proposed a tax cut for the wealthiest Americans to be funded by health care reductions for tens of millions of Americans. We're talking about 3.7 million Californians losing health care, according to the bill that's been proposed. They talked about a tax, quote unquote, reform that would be devastating for working people. So on the I think, conclusively disproved theory that cutting taxes for the richest Americans causes growth and creates jobs, I think we've seen that's absolutely false. So when I think about what's going on in Washington, D.C. as it pertains to California, I think that they are working off a completely different script. You might even say an opposite script where they are actually trying to exacerbate income inequality, they're trying to benefit the richest Americans, and they're trying to take away services from working families. I think the one that gets me in the gut as much as any other is the idea that they would take food away from poor kids in school to fund a tax cut for the richest Americans. Seems like Ebenezer Scrooge wouldn't do that. So I think there we are diametrically opposed to this administration and this Congress. I think in terms of rebuilding the state around the idea of a more sustainable way of living that will preserve the beauty and put us in a way of living that I think is much more pleasant, harmonious, and just. I don't see any, see them pushing as hard as they can to develop the fossil fuel economy, and I think that's diametrically opposed to the way that we think. And lastly, in terms of, I think that we're talking about what we did in 2016 was to try and register people to vote with our partners. We had 30 partners in California. We registered 807,000 Californians. What we, you know, with 8 partners in the labor movement, we knocked on 12 million doors in the swing states, and we were also on 370 college campuses. Our belief is the broadest democracy with the most American participation that fairly represents the society is the most just outcome and the best outcome. It's the most just, but it's also the smartest way to go. And we're talking about a group of people who have an avowed policy to take away the franchise from American citizens. How are we going to prevent people from voting? How are we going to take away their rights? I couldn't imagine. I think the threat to democracy that we're seeing coming out of Washington, D.C. is as profound as I've seen in my lifetime. And there's nothing that I would say that they're doing that I don't deeply disagree with and find, sincerely cynical and completely unacceptable.
Okay, so so Tom, you're
Sorry.
Yeah. So for your top issues, California needs to go it alone. And so let me just ask you this question. What type of leadership would California need if it was going to go it alone on issues of this magnitude?
Well, I think that
everybody's laughing.
There are two things. Look, I think that's an absolutely critical issue.
I mean,
because
it is.
These people
Right.
have a ton of power. And I think that we are very unrealistic not to keep that in the back of our heads all the time. They have an ability to affect us in a bad way that is profound. And so when we think about what kind of leadership we need, let me say this. The two things that we have focused on, one of them is grassroots. That the more Americans that participate, the more Californians that participate, the broader the registration, engagement, participation in our democracy, the better off we are. I'm a complete believer in democracy, that what we need is more democracy, and that is how we will get the best answers. But there's another thing going on here, which I also want to refer to, Mark, in answer to your question, and that's this. I believe that the radical conservatives in charge of our government in Washington, D.C. have successfully set the framework for virtually every policy area in the United States of America. And that the leadership that we need has got to be able to reframe those questions so that people whose lives are not about politics, just the working families of the world, can understand why what they're saying is not true. And so it's important that we be right on the issues, but more than that, it's important that we be able to refute what I think of as the big lies that they've been telling for decades. And I'll give you an example. I mean, one of the things that people in the United States have heard 1,000 times now is the great line from Ronald Reagan that the scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And he changed the idea that government could work for people. He changed the idea that corporations weren't in it for themselves, but were really here to solve the problems of Americans. And I am not I'm someone who's worked in the private sector for 35 years. I understand exactly how dynamic and effective the private sector is. But that is a huge story that has misled us in terms of policy since it started to be accepted. And when we look at the healthcare issue in the United States, the underlying point about cutting taxes, cutting services, is the idea that government can't work. Government can't solve problems. Government is unnecessary and is a burden on the people. That's just not true. And there's a number of those, I think, stories. One of them's climate. The idea that we've let these people get away with the idea that we don't believe in science in thinking about natural problems. I don't believe we've called them out in the way they deserve at all. I think that's something where they have a specific political reason, namely big gifts from fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel interests, that means that Republicans have been willing to say, we really don't know, there's nothing we should do, we should build on our fossil fuel economy. And that's just not true. And no one has called them out on it. And what we're seeing now, what we saw yesterday in response to this firing of the FBI director, was a willingness by the administration to look America in the eye and lie. And it was obvious. Anyone who's a parent, you could look at that and just go, oh my gosh, honey, don't do that. I think we need leadership that can reframe this, because that's when California won't be on our own anymore. When people understand that actually what this state stands for, inclusiveness, openness, a society that believes that we work better together, that's what works. We're working. The states that have taken their kind of dog-eat-dog jungle mentality to the utmost, like Kansas, go take a look how that's working. Really poorly. Not just really poorly for the people who are who want to go to school in Kansas, but also the people who want to run businesses in Kansas. That is a philosophy that has run its course and failed. And it is time for people to start to understand that, and for us to reorient ourselves to building a brighter future, which is what California stands for.
And so is there anything else you want to say about leadership qualities that, other than reframing the issues? Let me just ask the question another way. We've got a governor, we've got a legislature, we've got constitutional officers in California, we've got a delegation. So we've got our elected representatives in California. Are they, are they providing the leadership that we need today? And if not, what else do we need that we don't have?
Well, I think there's no way not to give Jerry Brown a big thank you and a big round of applause. I think that if we remember when he came, it's always good to start in a job at the bottom because everything looks better. But by goodness, we can all remember looking at the people in this room what it was like to be bankrupt, and what it was like when we were paying state employees with scrip, and when we were cutting the shelters for battered women because we couldn't afford it. And those were very, very dark days for Californians. So the fact that we have righted our ship, that we are solvent, that we have a rainy day fund. Before I came in here, Mark and I were sitting in a room and we were going through the May revision to the budget. And they were adding for next year $1.4 billion for schools, particularly in poor districts. They were adding money for childcare. They were adding money for home health care. It was the kind of putting money back into the services that we had to cut so hard after 2008. So we really have to take give a lot of credit to the governor for what he did. But I think when you're asking about going forward, I don't think there's any question, but honestly, there's another big step for us to take, and that's the truth. And I think that when we look at that,
What is that big step?
I think if you listen to what I said, we really do. We've got to address income inequality in this state. We have to. I think when we look at rebuilding this state, we really have to rebuild it for the 21st century. You know, an awful lot of this state was built around cars and sprawl, and that isn't going to work. And we really have to. It's going to put people to work in this state for decades. We have to make sure they're well-paid jobs and fairly distributed, but we're going to have to rebuild it. And the other thing is, there is an imbalance in this state between special interests and voters. And that's just the case, the truth. And if you look at the propositions we've pushed, there have always been to try and get people to pay their fair share. If you look at what corporations pay as a percentage of the budget, it's gone down by about 2/3 in the last 50 years. It's gone down from somewhere in the low to mid 20s to somewhere between 5 and 8%. That's a gigantic move.
So let's take your first big issue, income inequality, which is a big issue. And it's an important issue, and it's a growing problem. Poverty, as well as the differences between the wealthy and everyone else in the state. What action should we be taking right now to address income inequality? We've talked about the fact that what Congress is proposing, you say, is going in the wrong direction. What would be the steps that we should be taking to reduce income inequality in California?
Well, we've spent about 1.5 years trying to study this.
This is the Fair Shakes?
Yeah, something called the Fair Shake Commission. We traveled all over the state. We talked to experts from all over, but we also tried to visit all over.
You have a report that's coming out pretty soon?
The report should be coming, I think, next month.
Terrific.
But what it basically says is inequality relates to a series or a number of what you'd think of as traditional policy areas. So one of the things that's really important to how you live in California is where you put your head down at night. So where you live determines where your kids go to school, who you hang out with. It determines the air quality that you breathe. It determines how long it takes you to get to work. It determines what kind of food you get to buy. There are lots of places in California where you can't buy healthy food at a reasonable price. We also are at least 1 million units short because there are a number of incentives for local municipalities not to build housing. There are a number of municipalities that have not built the housing that they're supposedly have to build. So one of the things we have to do is deal with the housing shortage, which is severe. And you can see it both in terms of how long it takes people to get to work and in terms of how they live and in terms of the rents. I think public transportation is also an issue about inequality. In addition to education, which I think we're 49th, this isn't up to date because all these statistics tend to take a couple of years to catch up. But as of 2 years ago, we were 49th out of 50th on a cost-adjusted spending per pupil. We were between Louisiana and Mississippi. Not having good public education is legislating long-term inequality. That is something, you talk about what we have to do. People talk a lot about the education system in the state of California. There are some very traditional arguments that people get extremely heated about. We're 49th out of 50th. For everyone who thinks it's just who wants to blame the teachers, it's not the teachers. The fact of the matter is, this is something which we have to address with resources.
So we need to spend, you don't think we're spending adequate funding for schools?
No, we're not.
Do you have some ballpark number of what we should be spending?
I've looked at the numbers. I don't want to give you a hard number, but I know that it is not going to be free.
Let me ask you a related...
Well, let me tell you one other thing. I don't know if you guys know this, but people talk a lot about how much teachers make in the state of California. That's an issue in a lot of the education debates. We have a looming shortage, current shortage, but getting worse in terms of attracting people to the teaching profession and actually filling the jobs. So when you think, if you're spent time in the private sector, normally when you have a huge shortage of people to fill jobs, it's not because those jobs are so well paid that people refuse to take it because it's just too much.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question related to education. At PPIC, we have been studying higher education for a while and the future of the economy. And if on the current trends where we're on with our demography and our economy, we're going to be 1 million college-educated workers short by 2025. So you agree with that?
I saw those numbers too.
So what should we do about it? What's your...
So let's talk a little bit.
Okay.
One of the things I've had a chance to do as part of that study and just in general is to travel around California and go see some of the community colleges, the CSUs, the UCs. So let me give you some numbers just to put it in perspective. There are about 280,000 kids who go to UCs in the state of California. There are about 580,000 kids who go to CSUs. And there are 2.2 million kids in community colleges right now. So when you think about where the kids are going, that's kind of puts it in the ballpark in terms of where what we have to do. And let me say something else. I don't know if, there are probably a lot of parents in this room, so you have seen kids of this age, but I can promise you it is incredibly moving to go around the state of California and see how industrious and wonderful the kids are. It is extremely moving to see how sincere they are about working, how sincere they are about being good citizens, and how incredibly ambitious they are to get ahead. It is absolutely inspiring. They are fantastic. So when I think about meeting that, the first thing I want to make sure is that those 2.2 million kids going to community colleges are taken care of. Because I love the UCs and the CSUs, but that is a place where working families' kids go. 70% of those kids are working. Those kids are working, so that means they have a full-time job and they're going to school. They are really, really, really trying. And so I think making sure that that process works, that it either takes them into a good job or enables them to get to a four-year institution is something the state of California should be incredibly serious about. I think, when we look at the CSUs and the UCs, they're fantastic. I don't think people realize how incredibly proud we should be, not only of the kids, but the people who work there. They are absolutely inspiring, truthfully. They have a huge public purpose. And so, if you think about, I've talked to you guys, I started talking about housing, but honestly, if you think about the heart of California, it is the ability for kids to get a great education and get ahead as citizens, as family members, to drive the state, to make us what we want to be, to have that opportunity. And I can tell you, we should think of our public education system as a, gold, to be completely protected and, inspired by. And so we do need to fill those gaps, but really, if we will give the kids of California the chance, they will do it. Mm-hmm. They are incredibly sincere in trying to do the right thing.
I'd be interested in your views, because you've been in the business world, you're in the philanthropy world as well, about the changing nature of work. There's a lot of discussion about about what it means to be an employee, in a world that seems to be revolving around the gig economy. And so how do you think about the relationship between education and work, and what's work going to look like 10 years from now, and how should we be thinking about it from a public policy perspective?
Well, I actually come at this from a strange angle, because what I'm concerned about in the nature of work is the idea of treating working people as human beings. And when you think about where we're going in terms of the nature of work, we're doing the exact opposite. When you think about the gig economy, when you think about how people are trying to hire part-time workers so that they won't have to pay benefits, what you're seeing is a breakdown in work between the idea of hiring a person and hiring a commodity. And that shows up when we think about what's fair in terms of the relationship between employer and working person. And so that is what colors it for me, because what I can see is an increasing tendency on the part of business to think of employees as costs, not humans. And so when you think about the gig economy, you can have somebody who works for you 52 weeks a year full-time, but you know what? They're a private contractor. I don't have any responsibility for him or her. And when you think about part-time workers, it's the same. It's when you think about hiring services, so you have someone who's a security person, janitorial staff, you hire a service so you can pay minimum wage with no benefits through a service, whereas in fact, they're your employee full-time. So when I think about the changing nature of work, the question is, how do we set up fair rules between employers and employees? Because people seem to think that somehow the market is this fair animal that was sent down by God. And that is not true. Every market is just rules. It's just rules that human beings write. So, for example, 100 years ago, you could have hired a 12-year-old to work for 14 hours a day and paid him a quarter. And you can't do that now because human beings decided that's not fair. We're not doing that. And it is time for us to look at the rules. And that's why I think the labor movement is so important. It is really hard to think in a negotiation that you can win a negotiation if you don't even show up. You know, there's an old saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That's true in the employment world. If you can't negotiate, if there's no representation, I don't know how you think you're going to do well. So if you're a commodity where you just take what somebody offers you, you are not going to end up getting a living wage. And that's what we're seeing in California. And I'll give the number that blew my mind, which I learned 3 or 4 years ago, was that in Santa Clara County, which goes from just north of Palo Alto to just south of San Jose, so that's the richest county in the history of the world, right? I mean, in terms of wealth creation, there's nothing in history comparable to that county. 30% of the families are under poverty line. So when I say the whole idea of trickle-down has been discredited, the whole idea of trickle-down has been discredited. If 30% of the people are under the poverty line in the richest place in the history of the planet, cutting taxes on rich people is not going to work.
So we talk about the changing nature of work and the employee-employer relationship. We have to talk about health insurance. And many Americans get their health insurance through their employer, but some don't. Many in California do not. And there's a lot of concern about where we're going with Medi-Cal. There was concern before we were in a period of repealing and replacing, but now we appear to be headed for a repeal and replace. So what does the state do to respond to the financing of Medi-Cal? What's your idea? Do we go to a single payer system? Do we invest that money that the federal government won't invest? How do you see it?
Well, let me start. I asked Holly Mitchell this question. I don't know how many of you guys know State Senator Holly Mitchell from Los Angeles, who's a really, really smart lady. And I asked her this question a couple of months ago because she's in charge of the budget committee. And I was saying, how do you think about this when they're talking about, repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act? How do you think about that from a budget standpoint? And she said, you know, I really don't make contingent plans until I see what's happened, because it's impossible to know at this point where they're going to come out on this. And so I know that there's a broad range of outcomes that could happen, but I don't know where they're going to come out. And so my feeling on this is we're going to keep going just the way we are until we have something concrete to respond to. So that's my first point. We don't know where these people are going to come out. We've seen this House bill get passed, but we haven't even seen the Congressional Budget Office come out with what they think the costs are going to be, how many people are going to lose coverage, how much more expensive it's going to be for the people between 55 and 64. We know that when they did the first bill that they proposed that didn't pass, those numbers were horrendous. 24 million people, 3.7 million Californians, $5,000 apiece for the people between 55 and 64. So we know the numbers are going to be bad, but we don't know how bad. But we also don't know what the Senate's going to do. When I think about this, when I think about healthcare, we're at a point, healthcare's a right at this point. I think we've got to get over having that conversation. In the United States of America, we are not turning people away from the hospital when they're sick. Healthcare is a right. So the question is, how do we provide the best service to the most people at the most affordable cost? That's where we are.
Okay.
So when we think about the Affordable Care Act, huge step forward. You know, in terms of California, we went from 18% uninsured to 8% uninsured. That's, you know, when you think about what we're trying to do, that is a gigantic step in the right direction. But what we're also seeing in terms of healthcare, I thought there was a really interesting statement that came out of Omaha this weekend, where Warren Buffett was having his, whatever he calls it, his big capitalist bash or whatever. And he was talking about American competitiveness. And he said, you know, corporations love to complain about taxes. You know, we really need to cut the corporate tax rate. It's a crisis. You know, we're falling behind. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. He said, actually, if you look at corporate taxes as a percentage of GDP, since 1970, they've gone from 4% of GDP to 1.9% of GDP. Corporations are not losing their competitiveness internationally because they're paying too much tax. At the same time, healthcare as a percentage of GDP has gone from 5% to 17%. It's growing between 6 and 7. The long-term trend has been 6 to 7%, and we're in a very low inflation world. So when we think of your original question is, how do we think about healthcare? The ACA was a huge step forward, and we should applaud it. But it can't be the last step forward, because the fact of the matter is, if we're going to provide what I said, healthcare is a right, we need to get to a system that gets the most healthcare to everybody at the most affordable cost. And so the ACA is definitely not the end of the road. We're going to have to take the next step. The issue is going to be, in the meantime, we have to defend the step we got.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about another question that is on everyone's mind, and that's about immigration. California has probably about 2.5 million undocumented immigrants, has a very large immigrant population generally, and obviously the federal government's going in a very different direction now. What should the state be doing?
I think the state's doing the right thing. You know, I think we've misframed this argument. We've misframed this situation in my mind, because to me this is a big justice question. And I don't think that this case has been made effectively to the American people or even within the state of California. And that's this. If you have a society that depends upon the work of immigrants and you don't provide them a path to citizenship, that is inherently unjust. And so that is what should be in our mind all the time when we think about what we're doing in terms of immigrants and undocumented people. The fact of the matter is, we have an unjust system, and we are doing things that when you step back, we should be ashamed of ourselves for. And this administration should be ashamed of itself. In fact, they should be trying to come up with a just system to to resolve the issues that we have and to take care of the people who are here.
So in terms of what the state's doing, we're doing everything.
I think the issue is going to be getting, a lot of this is going to be about making sure that people have legal representation within the system.
Let me ask you a question about climate change and energy. Obviously, I'd be remiss to not ask you about that because you're one of the, the leaders in the country on this topic. Where are we in California now on climate change and energy policy? Where do you see things headed the next few years in California?
Well, I think, so I was one of the hundreds of Californians who were lucky enough to go to Paris in December of 2015 to participate in the Paris Accords. And honestly, California showed up like a major country in Paris. It was, and as I used to say to everyone, what did you think of the Pennsylvania delegation? Because there was no Pennsylvania delegation. I think there was one person from New York who happens to be a great guy, but it was literally hundreds of Californians, one person from New York. I think that I'm not sure everyone in California knows the profile that we have around the world. Because everyone in the world, I mean, we like to say we're somewhere between the 5th and 6th biggest economy in the world. We also have the most progressive energy laws in the world. So this is a state that is succeeding economically, that is a leader in terms of energy policy, and the only comparable in the world is Germany. So I don't actually go to climate conferences very often, but I went to one as kind of a vacation this year that was in Germany, partially because I wanted to see how people were viewing the new administration and California. So I was in a panel, and I started by saying, I am a proud American, but you should also know I'm a California Democrat, and I got a standing ovation for that. So let me say this, we aren't done. I mean, we are by no means done. But the fact, we have an urgent problem, and we can use that problem to address some of the other issues I brought up at the outset, Mark. For us to rebuild our state in a sustainable way is going to be decades of work. And that is going to be putting decent paychecks in working people's hands. We are going to have to, if you follow climate statistics, this is not something we can duck. We are going to address this, and we might as well do it the way that California has traditionally dealt with issues, which is to be forward-looking, optimistic, and aggressive. Because that is the way that we will build industries. That's, honestly, the thing that is distinctive to me about coming home to California is not that we live in this incredibly beautiful state. We live in this incredibly beautiful state. It is not that we're a majority-minority state. We are a majority-minority state, and it's a great gift to us. We are more optimistic. We are not afraid to look into the future and be honest with ourselves and figure we can solve problems. That is a huge advantage for this state. If we stop doing that, we're crazy, because that is what we've been able to do, and that's what we need to do here, is to sit there and say, not, oh my gosh, this is a terrible problem, but oh my gosh, there's something we need to do about this. Now let's get to work and get it done. And that's what we've done. The policy people here have done a good job in terms of energy policy going back to the 1960s. This is I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for being forward-thinking and optimistic and willing to do the right thing because we're not scared. And that is a huge hallmark of California that we should be proud of, and we should darn well make sure we keep.
We're going to stop there and ask some questions. Thank you. So I predict that somebody out here is going to ask you, Tom, are you running for governor? So I'm going to ask that for them while we get some. So you want to?
Right.
What do you?
In the back of the room?
Yes.
Do you want me to answer
Yes,
that
answer this one for us first, and then we'll go right to your question.
Look,
yes.
It's no secret that I've been thinking about running. I'm going to make that decision in the next few months. It's also no secret that I'm completely committed to working on the 3 issues that I started off by talking about. That's what I've been doing for the last 4.5 years since I left the private sector. That is the thing that gets me up in the morning and got me on a plane at 5:30 in the morning in DC to come here. I'm absolutely committed to doing that, and there's nothing that I would not do to try and make a dent in those issues.
Thank you. Question? Thanks for the answer. I knew it was coming anyway.
Hi, I'm Kim Alexander with the California Voter Foundation. Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Thanks for coming today, and thanks for sharing your priorities. You mentioned how people's experiences depend on where they live, and in my work over 20 years working in voting issues in California, I've seen that people have different voting experiences based on where they live, and people who live in counties that have less resources don't get the same quality and level of services that voters that live in wealthier counties. You see this in things like paid postage for voters in the Bay Area for vote-by-mail envelopes, whereas less wealthy counties can provide those services. And these problems are being exacerbated because our famously fiscally conservative governor continues to withhold funding in the state budget to pay for state-mandated programs that come from laws that require counties to treat voters equally. So I wonder if you have focused at all on this issue in your effort to try to strengthen democracy in California, and how a future governor in our state might address this issue to make sure that all voters have an equal chance of participating and voting regardless of where they live and how much money their county brings in. Thanks.
Did you get the question?
I got the question,
Okay.
and the question was the answer.
Yeah.
To be fair, we are when we think about where to go to register, engage, and empower citizens, it is overwhelmingly in poorer parts of the state. And so we have felt that if you look at the map of California and see who is underrepresented, you're absolutely right. They tend to be in less well-off districts. They tend to be younger. They tend to be people of color. And we have tried in our whole program and with our partners to directly address that, to go to the places where people are underrepresented and to do everything we could, not just to register them, but also to get them informed and involved so that they can participate along with everybody else, because we do believe what you just said is true, that having their voice is incredibly important, that everybody's voice together is the best answer, and anything we can do to make that happen is something that will get better decisions on all the other issues facing the state.
It's a good question, and if I had had more time, I would have asked you about your experiences with voter registration efforts last year. Yes?
Hello, my name is Olga Sid, and I have a question regarding climate change. What would you recommend California to do in resolving the industrial explosions that happen in Torrance in Southern California? I mean, we talk about it's important where we live, but there's been so many, I think, lack of oversight on manufacturing industries in Southern California, no parks, no open space. So what do you recommend on California resolving those issues?
Thank you.
I don't think that you can, one of the things that we believe about climate change, because you started by asking about climate change, we don't believe it can be separated from the kinds of particulate pollution, toxicity, and corporate oversight issues that you're talking about. From our standpoint, every one of those issues comes into the idea of how are corporations operating within our state in a safe way and acting as responsible citizens. So, that is something where we see the solution to climate change being the solution to toxicity, to safety, and to particulate matter in the air. And that we think that the policies and the programs have got to address them all together.
Another question from back here.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Barber. I started out
Could
as
you
a...
stand up, please?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
My name's Mary Beth Barber. I started out as a journalist and then moved into government communications for a while and then project management. And what you said about Reagan's statement and the trust that people have in government make me think about, okay, is there something going on with the way government as well as policy folks are communicating to the public? Recently, I was taking a look at the Edelman Trust Survey, and one of the conclusions that I came from it was that there are two things that government needs to do is create personable, empathetic content, as well as be hand in hand with IT, which is not the way government communications typically work. So I was wondering if you had any comment on that, and if you had somebody besides yourself to be a spokesperson for everything that you said, who would that be?
Is that like two questions or more? Yeah.
I'm trying to parse those questions
Yeah.
for 1 sec. So let me start by saying, do I think that government does a good job all the time interacting with the public, and would the interface, would they have a better reputation if the interface were more human and warm? As somebody who just went through TSA twice this morning, I would go with, yes, they could improve. I mean, obviously that's true. And I think that any time we talk about government, I mean, I come from a highly regulated industry where I had lots. I mean, one of the things that's true is, we have my wife and I started a community bank. So in California, which is 18 branches, and we're highly regulated. And it's a mission-driven bank, but we still have to satisfy a whole bunch of regulators, including the FDIC. And do I know that government sometimes is insensitive in the way that they treat American citizens? Absolutely. And is it important for the people who are running the government to have that in the back of their heads at all times? Absolutely. When you ask me about who does a good job in terms of making the case for a positive government, I think I have a ton of admiration for a lot of elected officials and career civil servants. There are a lot of them. I think that there is a sense, a way too pervasive sense that the people who run for office, the people who hold those jobs, are very self-interested. And I think that they are ambitious, but I think by and large, I know an awful lot of elected officials and an awful lot of full-time people who are civil servants who do a fantastic job, who sacrifice for it, who are very high-minded and sincere, and anybody who describes them that way is really giving them a bum rap. And I could give you a bunch inside California, and I could give you a bunch outside California. I really do think that. I think that it is inevitable in human interactions when one person has so much power over another that they can become arrogant and treat people badly. And I think that's honestly what you're referring to. And I think that it's important for the leaders of those institutions to be aware of that and to counteract it all the time. But I am a believer that the government is the will of the people. It's not imposed on the people. Our elected officials are the people who represent us to get the best answers for our common interests. And that is something that is necessary, it's important. Our experiment that honors government is something that is working out incredibly well, and we need to remember that and make sure that that narrative is heard.
Thank you. I have a final question for you that is related to this this question and your comment. If I think back to the 2010 experience with Prop 23, and the fact that you had bipartisan co-chairs. You were with George Shultz on the no side, a Democrat and Republican. Very different conversations we're having today about Democrats and Republicans. And this is really important for me as somebody who's running a nonpartisan policy research organization. Do you see a place and a time for finding common ground, Democrats and Republicans finding common ground today, and how do we achieve that?
So let me say this. George was the co-chair on No on 23 with me. He was also the co-chair on Prop 39.
Yes.
I started a study with Hank Paulson, who's a Republican, Mike Bloomberg, who's an independent, and I, to look at progressive energy policies, what it would cost the United States, which actually it makes us richer, and what it would cost if we didn't enact them, which is in fact, it destroys our economy. So that was, and I also started a nonpartisan business organization to lobby state by state for progressive energy policies called AEE, which is explicitly nonpartisan or bipartisan. I think I am not in any way, shape, or form thinking that Republican voters aren't normal Americans who I might disagree with, but who we share overwhelmingly the same values. And I'm not, George Shultz is still a friend of mine, Hank Paulson's still a friend of mine. Those guys are still working for the same issues that we were working on together when we had those efforts. I think what's happened, which has been a surprise for me and I would never have guessed, is that the elected officials in Washington, D.C., for reasons that confound me, in the Republican Party, honestly have gone down a very divisive path. And I think it is only honest to call that out. I think that to see an entire party refuse to accept science. I mean, don't forget, a couple of weeks ago, we had a march of scientists in the United States of America to honor the idea that science and truth matter. Did we think we'd have to do that? I like to joke about it, but that was a hot topic in the 15th century. That was when they burned people at the stake for talking about the solar system, not now. I think that if you look at the series of proposals that have come out of the Congress and the administration on taxes and on healthcare, and really go around California, talk to the people who they affect, go down and talk to immigrant rights groups about what is going on in their communities with ICE. If you really look, it's incomprehensible to me why they're making these choices. But what I do know is, I feel as if it is incumbent on, I feel like the people who are standing up against that are being patriots. And I don't think we should be compromising on the safety of Americans, the health of Americans, the dignity of Americans, the traditional basic rights granted us in the Constitution. And so I have no idea why they've gone off the rails. I view this as an aberration and a very threatening development, and I don't see anything to do but to absolutely stand up against it and refuse to accept it. I don't think there's another choice. I don't think we should compromise with it. I think if you watched those spokespeople for the administration come up with their overtly untrue explanations for what was happening with the FBI director, I don't think there's anything that we can do but stand and tell the truth. And I'm a business person. In these questions, you can look at the facts. This is just a question of absolutely looking at the facts and seeing what's happened. What we're talking about is mainstream American thought for the last 50 years. What we're talking about is absolute basic American rights going hundreds of years back, even beyond 1792. And so, are there plenty of Republicans who I have a ton of respect and affection for? Absolutely. But what the Republican Party is doing in Washington, D.C., I think I oppose virtually every appointment, virtually every policy.
Okay. Well, sounds like you have a big decision to make in the next few months. And we wish you the best with that decision, and appreciate your being here with us today. I think this was very informative for everyone. I hope this conversation was as informative for all of you as it was for me. And I appreciate the fact that you took the time to come here and give us your thoughts about what your vision is for California and our future, and how you see the priorities for the state and how to.
Can I make one last point?
Sure.
The last point I'd say is this. I do oppose what's going on in DC, but I also think they're missing so many great opportunities to do better. It's not just that I disagree with what they're doing. What they're not doing, the things that could move us forward, the chances for progress, the chances for a brighter, more prosperous, healthier America. As a dad of 4 kids, my kids want to think that we're going to be better off. They want to think that we have a big future together. And that's what I want. I don't want to think that all we're ever going to do is stop bad things. There are wonderful things that we have got to see together, have a vision together, and drive for.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Phil. Thanks all of you for joining us and for our sponsors. And thanks to all of you for being here today. Thanks.